Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marcia Ferranto, CEO of the National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum. Our museum reopened its doors to the public on August 27th of this year. At that time, we also reopened our first ever major exhibition, post 9/11, the evolution of American law enforcement. This exhibit has provided a rare opportunity to look more closely at the world of law enforcement, not just on the day of the 9/11 attacks, but during the 20 years since. Think back to September 11th, 2001. Our nation was stunned and shocked. There was unease, uncertainty, and confusion. How would we move forward as a nation, seeking stability and security from the threat of further attacks? Enter the changemakers, those leaders who helped our nation chart a course forward from the terror of 9/11. Today's program brings together an outstanding group of those leaders who will share their observations from 20 years ago and how they worked to build necessary change for law enforcement and for our American society. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for this conversation today. I also want to thank our generous sponsors who have not only made this program possible, but who have brought our exhibit to life. Many thanks to the Police Unity Tour, Goodyear, Bio One Inc., Thomson Reuters, 511 Tactical, and Adam Rose and Peter McQuillan. If this program is something you enjoy and you would like to help us continue our efforts to tell the story of American law enforcement, please take 30 seconds to make a donation to the museum by texting programs 2021 to 41444. Again, that's programs 2021 to 41444. It takes just a moment and it will make a real difference. Now, let me introduce to you our moderator for today, Jessica Tolliver. Jessica has served as the Director of Technical Assistance for the Police Executive Research Forum for the past 9 years and has over 2 decades of experience within the field of criminal justice. Through her work, she has helped local law enforcement agencies enhance community relationships and services, effectively allocate department resources by identifying and implementing cost-saving strategies, and improve systems and tools to foster internal and external legitimacy. She has a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan, Ford School of Public Policy, and a BA in political science and journalism from the University of Richmond. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm truly honored to be here today. I have the great pleasure of introducing the 5 panelists that will be speaking today. They have a wealth of knowledge and experience, and truly the only challenge I'll have moderating today is to ensure that each of them has enough time to share their knowledge with you. When you registered today, I'm sure you reviewed each panel member's impressive bio, but let me just take a quick minute to highlight each of these accomplished individuals. First, we have Ron Brooks. Ron is a founding member of Brooks Bodden Moore, a government relations and business strategy consulting firm based here in Washington, D.C. Prior to funding BBM, Ron served 38 years in law enforcement with extensive executive, management, investigative, homeland security, and criminal intelligence experience. Among the many experiences he's had, Ron was a founding member and chairperson of the DOJ's Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council, known as CICC, which is a federal advisory committee created after the terror attacks on 9/11 to advise and create policy guidance for the U.S. Attorney General and DOJ staff on matters involving criminal intelligence and information sharing. The CICC developed most criminal intelligence and information sharing policy frameworks that are now deployed by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies nationwide, and he will be sharing the impact of these policies with us today. Next, allow me to introduce you to Caroline Lynch. Caroline is the founder and owner of Copper Hill Strategies, providing client-focused government relations, strategic planning, legislative, and business development services. She has 15 years of Capitol Hill experience, including a decade with the House Judiciary Committee, where she served for 8 years as the chief counsel of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. On Capitol Hill, Caroline was at the forefront of developing some of the most high-profile privacy, cybersecurity, national security, and criminal laws of the 21st century, and she will be sharing some of her insights with us today. We also have Chief Ron Haddad. Appointed in 2008, Chief Ron currently serves as the Dearborn, Michigan Chief of Police. And I'm calling him Chief Ron because we have another Ron, so we have to distinguish between the two. He has forged best practices and presented at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Michigan Association of Chiefs of Police, and DOJ conferences on the use of force, de-escalation, mental fitness intervention, and special needs. He has served on several national task forces, including the IACP bias-free training for law enforcement executives. He's also recognized nationally for his community policing advocacy and will discuss with us today the details of the innovative programs he's developed. Next, we have my colleague and friend, Joshua Ederheimer. Josh has served as the Deputy Director of the Federal Protective Service at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security since 2017. Previously, Josh served in several senior positions at the U.S. Department of Justice, including Principal Deputy Director and Acting Director of the DOJ Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, also known as COPS. Prior to joining the federal government, though, Josh spent 22 years with the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., rising to the rank of Assistant Chief. While there, he designed and implemented numerous policing programs, several of which he will discuss with us today. Last but not least, we have Mike Rollins. Mike is currently an independent consultant supporting the FBI's Countering Violent Extremism Office. He is a former special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington Field Office Counterterrorism Division. Mike is an expert in counterterrorism, intelligence, and counterintelligence investigations and operations. Throughout his career, he was responsible for crafting responses to major terrorist incidents, including the East Africa embassy bombings, the Millennium Conspiracy, the attack on the USS Cole, and the attacks of September 11th, 2001. He has a plethora of experiences and insights to share today. So thank you, panelists, for joining us today, what's sure to be a very informative and interesting discussion. First, I want to kick this off with Caroline. Most people are aware that the lack of information sharing between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, as well as the information analysis and lack of reviewing actionable intelligence, contributed to the events that occurred on 9/11. In an attempt to plug these holes and fill these gaps, Congress passed a number of privacy, cyber, national security, and criminal laws. A lot of people have heard about these, like the USA Patriot Act, the FISA Amendments Act, the USA Freedom Act, but don't necessarily know what they do. Can you talk about how these pieces of legislation provided tools for law enforcement to fight terrorism?
Sure. Thanks, Jessica. And it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today and with this very distinguished panel. I think folks are probably most familiar with the Patriot Act, enacted 45 days after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And the Patriot Act was actually 10 titles of legislation. So it was an incredibly large piece of legislation that accomplished a number of different issues. It stood up the Terrorist Screening Center at the FBI. It implemented expansive money laundering and banking regulations to address anti-money laundering. But it's probably most well-known or most infamous for its law enforcement and intelligence gathering provisions that have been amended over the years, over the last 2 decades. So I thought I'd talk a little bit first about the Patriot Act. Particularly for those law enforcement and intelligence gathering tools, I think what's important for the attendees to understand today is that the Patriot Act is not a standalone piece of legislation. It's not a standalone law. What it did in the areas of law enforcement and intelligence gathering is amend existing laws that were already in place. So for example, it amended certain provisions of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It amended criminal statutes like the Wiretap Act or the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And in a variety of ways, what the Patriot Act originally did was take certain authorities that had been permitted by the court system. So there were certain practices that were in place for drug trafficking, for example, or that certain courts had permitted in the areas of search warrants or electronic surveillance. And what Congress did was codified a number of these tools for use in counterterrorism. So perhaps the most long-lasting of those provisions, and arguably one of the most important, is called the business records provision. And really, it's a court-ordered subpoena. It's the way in which, since 9/11 and since the enactment of the Patriot Act, our intelligence officials and law enforcement agents have been able to gather information through business records to try to thwart terror plots across the country. And that is a tool that's been utilized significantly in the last couple of decades, along with a handful of other provisions, both in the criminal context and for intelligence gathering. I think the one thing I would note too that the Patriot Act did is Congress made a number of these provisions temporary. So they placed a sunset on them so that Congress would be required to go back and revisit them several years later. And Congress did that again in 2006, making most of the temporary provisions permanent, with just a handful kept temporary and reauthorized periodically over the following decade. So I do think that there are some myths and misunderstandings about what some of these provisions allowed law enforcement or intelligence gathering to do. For example, in the business records context, there was a significant amount of concern that it would be used to surveil the library records of public library patrons across the country. In fact, my understanding is that there's been one instance in the last 2 decades in which that authority was used to acquire any kind of library reading records from a public library. And so part of the challenge for Congress and for the law enforcement community is to try to dispel the myths of exactly what law enforcement is allowed to do in the intelligence gathering context, and what steps they're required to take before they can deploy certain tools. So for example, whether it's a wiretap or electronic surveillance, that they must first go to either a criminal court or to the FISA court and obtain a court order. And there are the checks and balances that are built in on the back end of those authorities as well. So I'll stop there, Jessica, in case, hopefully I've answered your question, but in case other folks wanted to chime in too.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much for that. And thank you for mentioning that, because there's a lot of information that I want to cover and I want you all to share. But feel free to respond to each other and elaborate on certain points, because you all have unique and important experiences to share. So I will ask questions, but please feel free to respond to each other if you want to comment on anything Caroline just said. Okay, well, then I'll just go on. To Ron Brooks. After 9/11, local law enforcement came together with state and federal law enforcement agencies, as well as other public safety partners, to create methods for enhanced information sharing to try to prevent another terrorist attack. And, you know, Caroline just walked through some of the legislation that allowed for this, but can you talk to us about the methods and policies that were created, such as the National Network of Fusion Centers and the suspicious activity reporting?
Sure. So first of all, thanks to the museum and Jessica and Marcia for having me. I think it's important to just take a little look at history. You know, before the attacks on 9/11, I believe that most of my colleagues in law enforcement and domestic law enforcement thought that the role of preventing terrorism, you know, that was a role for the FBI. It was a role for the intelligence community. It might be a role for DOD working overseas, maybe interaction with the State Department, others. But it wasn't really a role for law enforcement. But I think on 9/11, when we woke up and we saw first responders running into the Twin Towers, responding into the Pentagon, responding out to Shanksville, when we really thought about who knows America's communities, it's local law enforcement. It's at state, county, city, tribal, campus law enforcement that really knows the anomalies and can spot that. So think back before 9/11, the things that we take for granted today, fusion centers, the Department of Homeland Security, the Director of National Intelligence, the Program Manager for Information Sharing Environment, none of those programs existed. They existed because of the hard work of the Congress and the hard work of the administration to stand up an infrastructure to deal with this unprecedented attack. One of the things that I was most proud of was that right after the attacks, when IACP met, the International Association of Chiefs of Police in Toronto, the Twin Towers, Pentagon, Shanksville were still smoldering. And a small group got together and said, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this. We have to find a way to harness the power of 800,000 state and local law enforcement officers, 18,000 law enforcement agencies around the country. We can't just rely on our federal partners. That led to the creation of the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council and the development of the first National Criminal Intelligence Sharing Plan, the Fusion Center guidelines, the Fusion Center baseline capabilities, which led to a lot of things that we take for granted today. See something, say something, having Fusion Center or terrorism liaison officers in the community, going out with programs like building communities of trust where we engage the community. And so we built kind of from the ground up an infrastructure. The CICC did that. The Director of National Intelligence formed Homeland Security and Law Enforcement Partners Board that I was privileged to serve on as well. We changed the structure. I'll tell you how I knew things had really changed is as a state law enforcement officer, I've never been in the FBI headquarters. I mean, I'd never been invited in. There wasn't a lot of reason to interact with the Bureau. We did certainly back home, but not from a policy standpoint. And several years into this process, as the chair of the CICC, or maybe I was the vice chair, Russ Porter might have been the chair, we were sitting right next to Director Mueller, hosting a summit of law enforcement executives from around the country. That's how much things had changed. And so, the development of real process to share information, real process to analyze it, building analytic standards, helping to train up a whole cadre of analysts that hadn't existed before. I think that all of us that participated in this, and I think everybody on this panel did participate in that process, can be proud of what we built. And I think it's just important to look back to where we were before. And when we sometimes feel frustrated that we don't think we've done enough, there's always room for improvement, but we have come a long way since 9/10.
Thanks, Ron. You make very good points. I do want to follow up with you a little bit on fusion centers. A lot of people have heard of them. They know they exist, but they don't really understand how and why they were created, how many there are, and what sort of products they put out for the law enforcement community. If you could take a minute to hit on those notes,
Sure.
That'd be great.
So based on the recommendations of the National Criminal Intelligence Sharing Plan and then subsequent documents, the Fusion Center guidelines and baseline capabilities, the nation began to build out fusion centers that are designated, that are recognized by DHS, designated by governors. They're locally or state owned. There are currently 80 of them in the states and territories. Some major urban area fusion centers like mine. I was a fusion center director in San Francisco. I had a large 10,000 square mile area. We serviced a population of about 9 million. And then some are statewide centers, but they exist to be that coordination point, to coordinate threat information, to layer that against critical infrastructure and other threats, to bring in the information from local law enforcement and the community, from fire, public health, other community members, and to serve as that conduit between our federal partners, the FBI, DHS, INA, and others, to get threat information out and to get information on potential threats back up the chain. It's not generally an investigative agency, although some do have an investigative component. It is a true analytic and information sharing component. And it has become, we started out as a counterterrorism we built them for counterterrorism, but they've really become all crimes, all hazard, and they deal with that community violent crime. They deal with human trafficking. They deal with gun crimes, and they continue to deal with counterterrorism and domestic, both international and domestic. So they've become really a part of the fabric of law enforcement. But most of them have embraced all of their public safety partners. For instance, in my fusion center, I had public health, I had the fire community, I had the critical infrastructure community, I had people that were engaged out to community groups, to advocacy groups. We try to embrace all of it.
Yeah, and I think the big thing there was you're all sitting in the same place, which makes that information sharing so much easier. It breaks down the silos that existed before 9/11 so that you can have these informal discussions and share information up, down, and throughout your community. So
right. And we're not only sitting all in one space, but we're able to share each other's databases. We all had access to different databases. So in my fusion center, we had DEA, the Marshals, the FBI, TSA, lots of state and local agencies, and we were able to share across the board. We were able to huddle up. We were one of the lucky ones. We were co-located in FBI space, and so we had a very close working relationship with the FBI, but all of our federal partners. But we were then able to kind of harness the power of the 130 or 40 law enforcement agencies and all of the fire agencies, public health agencies, EMS agencies, others that we dealt with. So it becomes. Fusion centers have been a game changer, in my opinion, and are now recognized as an extremely important partner. The FBI speaks about the importance of fusion centers all the time. DHS INA speaks about the importance all the time, and I think they're have really made a difference in how we share information.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you. Real quick, a point of order. I'm to remind you that the panel would love to hear your questions as well as mine. So please use the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A to submit any questions you have, and we'll address those at the end of the session. We'll make sure we save some time for that. I want to go next to Josh. You were a captain with the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C. when 9/11 occurred. I know that local police took on additional roles and responsibilities as a result of the new tools and information sharing initiatives that have been discussed. So can you detail for us what these changes look like, from your boots on the ground perspective?
Yeah, I just wanted to start. I've been thinking about this by saying it's such a privilege to be asked to speak on this panel. And I'm just reflecting, I've been watching all of the documentaries and the remembrances of 9/11. And honestly, I feel like I'm not worthy to be on this panel. And I don't know I feel like a lot of folks in law enforcement feel that since I was not on the ground at Ground Zero or at the Pentagon or Shanksville, that level of sacrifice, those who died, those who were on the site, sometimes I honestly just feel like I'm not worthy because I didn't sacrifice the way they did. I've been talking with some colleagues who have been on the scenes there, and I just want to recognize them because I was a law enforcement officer. I was a DC cop on the ground. I was a commander during the attacks, but I don't really feel I did all that much. And you can already tell I'm getting emotional thinking about it. Something that just came over me that day. I was working on duty that day. I got to tell you, was just fear. I was in such fear on the ground. And I feel like I'm speaking for law enforcement officers across America who are also in fear. Think about the cops on the ground across the country that day. I was talking to my wife. Should I go get the kids? Should I get them out of daycare? Should I go home? I'm like, yes, go get them. But I was at work and on duty, and I didn't come home for a week because I needed to be there, as did others in law enforcement and public safety and all the first responders. But I want to talk about cops. So I had all that hanging over my head. On the ground, communication back then was not what it is today. We were getting word that the State Department was under attack. There might be other attacks on law enforcement and other sites, it was a lot of confusion. That day, I remember me and my team, I was a captain, we grabbed shotguns. Didn't matter what rank you were, didn't matter if you were detective, plainclothes, uniform, and we were ready for battle. We had been training for crime fighting. We've been training to and focusing on crime and getting bad guys in our communities. And now we felt like soldiers. And that was huge. So that setting that context is that, you know, and how we move forward from that day on, I believe, like Ron has mentioned, it was a reset for the entire profession. Our mindset had to change. On the ground, once things were stabilized and we realized that we were not going to be continually attacked on the 12th and the days after, that's when things started to change. Some was fast, some was gradual. Broadly, though, I'm going to start broadly and just really echo what Ron Brooks said about fusion centers. Cops on the beat of all rank, we were focused on crime in our neighborhoods. But who knows a neighborhood better than the law enforcement officers patrolling and serving in those communities? And like Ron said, that's 800,000 law enforcement officers who really know their community. But any detective worth their salt in law enforcement in America knew that if you had a crime you wanted to solve, you started with your patrol officers because they knew the communities, both infrastructure and people. And there was this huge gap, I think, after 9/11 in getting information from the field to some kind of central spot. And that is really where fusion centers came into play. I can tell you in Washington, D.C. and in the entire National Capital Region where our fusion center was located, we had access to these forms that the fusion centers created called SARs, Suspicious Activity Reports. And our officers, including myself, could fill out these forms right from their cars and send them to the fusion centers. Just think of how that can lead to coordinated information sharing. And when Ron talked about all crimes, it turned out to be very helpful, not just for fighting terror, but also fighting the terror in our communities. So not to take up all the time here, I have lots more to say about what changes there were on the street for the street police officer and the street police commander. But I will say that the fusion centers and the changing roles of the street cops were two of the biggest benefits to creating safer communities.
Jessica, could I just build on something Josh said? So, the SARS, the Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, which became See Something, Say Something is how the public mostly knows that, but it was the collection of all that data. It was a huge effort led by Department of Justice at BJA by a guy named Tom O'Reilly. And we created, through the CICC, indicators of terrorism standards. And we got that out and literally by video trained most cops in America through the cooperation of the IACP and the National Sheriff's Association, major cities and major counties. We trained the fire community. We were able to build a true infrastructure and then train, TLOs or FLOs or ILOs, whatever you want to call them, the liaison officers working with the fusion centers, build analytic capacity so that we could turn those suspicious activity reports into something actionable, whether it was terrorism, whether it was a crime or whatever. And we did that, at a pretty, when I look back on it, it was a pretty quick pace, something that I'm proud that we all were able to come together on.
Thank you, both Ron and Josh. Josh, I do think it would be interesting to hear because, you were talking about boots on the ground, their work changed and they had to think more globally. It wasn't just about local policing anymore. It was about global events and how they needed to respond to that. Or as Ron said, they needed to learn about these terrorist indicators and react to those as well, look for those and react to those. Like how was that incorporated into everyday policing?
Sure. So, I mean, keep again the context of the time. CompStat was really big. And I remember as a captain standing in front of this panel I call it getting CompStatted. And I needed to know about every single crime, how many guns were recovered, where were domestic violence incidents occurring. I was super focused on my sector that I was in charge of. And I expected the lieutenants and sergeants and officers that work for me to be also focused on the crime in their neighborhood. I wanted them to know. I got to be honest with you, didn't necessarily think about where there might be a fertilizer plant or a waste transfer station. We didn't really look at bridges as, that important. That's a bridge. We got to make sure there's not homeless under the bridge, not, hey, it's a major route into the nation's capital. Could someone be trying to blow it up to disrupt commerce in the nation's capital? It changed the mindset from the I don't want to call it the lowest level, from the operational level all the way up to command, to look at your community differently. And I started paying much more attention to international news. I started reading the front page of the Washington Post, not just the local section where they were talking about what crime was happening in communities. And I feel that the local cops really had to understand the global picture. And that in itself was a major change. How that affected commanders on the ground. So the local police officer would need to know what religious institutions were on their beat, what companies might be on their beat, nonprofits, what kind of possible dangerous facilities, meaning if there's a gas plant or a gas storage facility. Gas stations have gas storage. Some are larger than others, and you really needed to know all of that on your beat. But the street commander needed to have the blueprints of large buildings or schools. We need it ready in case there was some kind of attack. The commanders needed to know all of the hospital administrators if we needed to set up mass casualty stations. The commanders had to know and have access to the phone numbers and contact information of all of the leaders of religious institutions in a particular sector. These were not necessarily things that were formalized prior to 9/11. They were informal. You needed to know. Good cops knew their community and the people on them. Good commanders knew on a broader level, but it wasn't really thought of as a centralized gathering of perspectives beyond just your beat. A lot of times patrol officers are not allowed to leave their beat, or at least at the time that was the case. So you were micro-focused. In 9/11, you became macro-focused. Those couple examples.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your personal story. I'm sure that touched people, and we appreciate that. And you're still worthy. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, of course. Now, I want to stay with the local perspective for a minute and talk to Chief Ron. As the chief of police in Dearborn, Michigan, which is home to one of the largest Muslim communities in the United States, your agency faced very specific challenges following 9/11. Can you walk us through those challenges and some of the innovative programs you developed to strengthen the trust between the police and your Arab and Muslim community members?
Certainly I want to be clear. I was in Detroit at the time 9/11 hit, and we always had a regional approach to our partners, and it was easy to partner with Dearborn and other communities. I can tell you what Josh has said and Ron has said, I can relate to all of that. And, we had to attack it on many fronts. In Detroit, for example, we have the busiest international border in the country there. And you had 18,000 trucks that came through every day. $2.2 billion in commerce. Average truck line was 1,600 miles. So, they basically serviced North America all the way down to the Mexican border. So it was a high consequence. We also had 4,000 doctors and healthcare professionals that came from Canada to work in the state of Michigan every single day. And simultaneously with that and other very critical infrastructures that we had to start watching, including a huge water intake plant in Detroit, which serviced, half of the lower peninsula here in Michigan, we had to deal with our community. We had a very diverse community. We had Arabs, we had Italians, we had Bangladeshis, we had Hispanics, and basically because they all looked Arab in varying degrees, they all came under attack. Their stores and gas stations were attacked. They were threatened. They broke their windows out, cut wires to the buildings, and so on. And put phony bombs. One place did have a pipe bomb actually that was a real bomb on the city's west side. So we had to keep them calm, meaning the entire community. And we had to also watch what was going on globally and nationally. I want to also touch on two things. Number one, we did quickly reach out to major city chiefs, and we were sharing information like overnight and IACP and others, which would have never happened prior to 9/11. And then something innovative we did. My police chief at the time was a 2-star general in the Army, and he was in the Pentagon when it got struck. He came back home and he called us in and he says, we want to try to help the feds. What do you think? And what they had was 5,000 people on student visas here that kind of fit the profile of the people that attacked us that day. 23 years old, here on student visas, some expired, etc. And there was 5,000 in the state of Michigan that the feds were interested in out of 350 Arab Americans. So what I convinced the chief at that time, we need to call in all the social agencies, all the civil rights agencies, all the press agencies that, deal and, provide information to the immigrant populations in our city and in our region, and have them put the information out there. 5,000 out of 350,000 is a small percentage. We didn't want to have a major scare in our state. And after meeting with the U.S. attorney, it was decided that we would send them letters first and have them turn themselves in just to verify their immigration status and their visa status. And that's what we did. And it worked out pretty good. Less than 0.5% failed to show up. But on the backdrop of that, it really had us all working together to keep our nation safe. And it really alleviated a lot of fear. I can tell you going forward, it's an up and down world when it comes to fear and threats. We have to always remind our citizens that they're Americans and they remind us of the same. And if I have to pick one institution, although there's many, I would say that we've been very successful with galvanizing our faith-based communities to come together with law enforcement at all levels, federal, state, county, and local. And they have been instrumental in keeping the community safe and keeping them calm, which is so important. And that happened with the gun programs that came under the Obama administration. That happened when we had the flight restrictions and after President Trump came into office, and the visitor restrictions that went up. And so we called them all together with every time something happened, because there was a great deal of concern. Number one, they felt they would be targeted. Number two, they have grandparents and parents all over the Middle East. And I had Yemenis tell me that if they had to leave the country and not come back, they had to go and check on their parents. And I think that's pretty heartfelt by all of us. Some of us don't have to go so far to check on our parents. So all those proactive measures to make sure that our community is taken care of has net a safer southeastern Michigan. I won't bore you to death, but I can tell you that right here in Dearborn, to fast forward, we started a program here and we had people report their own family members that may have been teetering on acts of violence up into including terrorism. And with the 5 or 6 cases that were reported to us, the common thread, as you could guess, it was mental illness and mental fitness. But again, schoolmates, places of worship, and family members reported all 5 of these cases that I'm referring to. And so we're in a better place. And I go by the firm belief that I'm going to trust everyone until they prove to be untrustworthy. And I've been asked, will your people, with a finger in my face, I might add at times, will your people report acts of terror? I said, if a barefooted woman is going to chase a B&E guy down the street, I'm pretty in the middle of the night, I'm pretty convinced that they trust us enough to report acts of terror or suspicion of acts of terror. And I can tell you that, as many of you know, but in case our participants and our viewers don't know, we've had just about every Homeland Security training available to man right here in the city of Dearborn and in Detroit when I was there. And every one of our members across the board of our community did participate. So again, when you include the community and the decision-making, you demystify what we're doing, we're all safer for it.
Hey, Jessica, this is Josh, just piping in. Ron, just listening to you, you are the epitome of what community policing is all about. You just defined it. That thinking is where I don't think cops meaning law enforcement officers, get enough credit. People are watching a lot of TV or the news, and they what you just described, Ron, is speaking from your heart and your philosophy as a chief. And it just speaks so well to where law enforcement is today in the United States and where they were back then. Just listen to what he said, the importance of respecting people and their rights. It's really something that should be shouted about the country, because I really appreciate what you said, Ron. You're a great example.
Thank you, Josh.
If I could add, I think Chief Haddad, made such a great point. And I can recall in early CICC meetings, and as Josh said, I mean, the country felt like we were at war, and we had never experienced this before. And our federal partners, including people directly from the White House, came and spoke to our group and said, it's time to get rid of some of the rules that governed how we shared information, like 28 CFR Part 23 and others. We're at war. It's time to change. And the thing that I'm very proud of is that our group, the state and local members of that committee, pushed back and said, look, in Washington, D.C., you don't have that local constituency. You don't have to go to your town hall meeting. You don't have to go to your place of worship. You don't have to go speak at the PTA or speak at a community group. We need to have, the only way we can exist as state and local police officers is to have the trust and respect of our community. The only way we're going to have that is to have a strong, guardrails that help govern us. And so even though 28 CFR Part 23, which was the law about how we shared information, didn't even apply in a lot of instances, we took the stance that it applied in all instances. When we developed at the CICC all of our policies, we brought in the ACLU and other advocacy groups to get their opinion. We didn't always agree, but we got their opinion, and we said, hey, how can we work together to develop this guideline so that it's something that you believe in. One time I sat down with a senior ACLU guy who was always, upset with what we were doing. And I said, we're working really hard to get along. And he says, hey, look, the fact that I'm not suing you, you're doing something right. He goes, it's not my job to get along with you, but we appreciate being at the table and part of the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both for chiming in. And Chief Ron, thank you. Your outreach programs have been well documented and truly serve as a best practice for a lot of agencies across the nation. So thank you for sharing. I want to move on to Mike, who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. We're speaking about the importance of strengthening relationships with all of our community members. So I want to go back to the national level now and ping you, because As the former special agent in charge of FBI's counterterrorism division, I know you were a founding member of the FBI Arab American and Muslim Advisory Council. So can you talk to us about how that helped to mitigate threats and some of the success you had there?
Sure. Thank you. And as the other said, thank you for the invitation. I think this topic, which Ron started on, and I think it's appropriate that you get the local flavor as he could provide as a chief's perspective from a couple different cities. And the challenges in a national environment become magnified by the fact that most large Arab American Muslim groups are headquartered in Washington, D.C. So whether you like it or not, all of those complaints that are lodged throughout the country on a lot of the discrimination and abuse and, ill will and ill treatment funnel on up. And then the national leaders have it here, but didn't have a place necessarily to take it. So I had attended a forum hosted by Jim Zogby's group called the Arab American Institute called Candidates Night. And every year, every candidate running for any office is invited to come speak. And they had me come for I wasn't running for office, obviously, but I came to speak on behalf of law enforcement, as did the United States Attorney, as did a rep from Immigration and Naturalization Service, because their issues were germane to the community concerns. And it went on all night, and then they opened it up for Q&A, and the overwhelming majority of questions came to law enforcement. Fairfax County was there. Tom Manger, who everyone knows from his time in Fairfax, and I tell him every time I see him, he abandoned us for Montgomery County, and then he couldn't stay in retirement, so now he's up at Capitol Hill, where they could not have done better, in my opinion. But putting that aside, Tom was there. Every single question came to law enforcement. Most of them came to the FBI. And it was my first lesson in how poor a job we had done, and I would say maybe in some instances continue to do, educating not just that community, but the American public on what the FBI does and does not do, can and cannot do, and what the rules, the regulations, the guidelines, the Attorney General's guidelines, all command that we do in order to keep us between the sidelines. And I walked out of that forum that night and somebody said, "Will you stand and answer questions?" I said, "I'll stay for breakfast. I will stay here as long as there's another question on the floor." And that became kind of my mantra when I went to the community. I'm staying all night. You're not going to throw me out. You're not going to kick me out. I took my share of tomatoes and bricks, as I said, but at a certain point, you get to be a certain age, and that part really doesn't matter so much as can you get to the people that really matter and will try to help you make a difference. And I came out of there embarrassed because I live in Fairfax County. I work in Fairfax County. My children go to school in Fairfax County. I worship in Fairfax County. I didn't know a thing about this community. And so with that, we invited all the leaders of ADC and AAI, Muslim Public Affairs Council, the Adams Center in Chantilly, Muhammad Majid, to come into the Washington field office and sit down and put on the table all of your comments, questions, concerns, criticisms, and we will hammer them out one by one every month. And if there's an apology to be made as a result of anything the FBI did, I will stand up at the forum of your choosing and I will apologize to your community. But we're going to get one agreement. We are going to agree on the facts and we're going to agree on the truth. And so we started those relationships, many of which I still have, 20 years later to this day. And the lesson I learned is you're always going to have, and pardon my characterizations, but the rabid right and the loony left. My focus is on that great segment in the middle that you don't hear a lot about or from, that I've come to believe really do want to help. In the spirit of post 9/11, when the FBI opened the doors to SIOC, the Strategic Intelligence Operations Center, anybody who wanted to come in could come in, sit down, listen to the director's morning and evening briefs, and you couldn't find a corner of a desk to sit on because it was that crowded. Everybody wanted to do something. You always hear about that, not always, but recently and particularly about the unity that existed for a long time after that. And then eventually the pendulum swings and you wind up where we are. So the other lesson I learned was you have to show up every time you get invited. And it's not just for 15 minutes at the front end or the back end or, stay for 10 minutes and then leave. You have to show up every time, all the time. And that's the only way you're going to gain credibility. And I knew that there were people at these forums that didn't want me, that didn't like me, and that was okay. But as long as you can keep the conversation civil, fact-based, and attempt to make some progress, You just have to be patient. And so if you fast forward post 9/11 and you look at the number of cases that evolved in Northern Virginia in particular, which was the responsibility of the Washington field office, I would have to say in hindsight that it proved as beneficial as anything else that we had done. But it was a lot of hard work. And you have to accept the fact that people, even in the office, weren't on board with the program, didn't think it was a valuable use of time. And they said, well, how do you know it's gonna help? Well, you don't. But as one of my favorite conversations between the director and the then head of weapons of mass destruction, and the director was trying to get his sense around the bureau, Director Mueller, and he's fairly new. And he said, not facetiously, but what do I need you for? And it was the best answer I ever heard. He said, well, today you probably don't need me, but when you need me, you're really going to need me. And so that's kind of the lesson learned is as more people who initially started out distrusting came to engage, came to understand the organization, came to understand, and it's always been my belief that every single case the FBI has ever worked had someone from some community and the public involved in it. I never believed we could do our job without the help and support of the American people. And I never will believe that. And as I believe it was Sir Robert Peel who started the Scotland Yard said, the police are the people and the people are the police. And if you don't have that connectivity, you may succeed, but it's going to be uphill all the way. And so I'm proud of the work that we did in that. As Chief Adad said, you can always do things better. There's more ways to improve on it. I'll leave it my last concern that I think probably all of us have who retired out of local, state, or federal law enforcement. You get believers behind these programs and they work and you're happy and you're proud they did. Who's thinking about the successor generation? The FBI loses on average 500 agents a year times 20 years to retirement. That's 10,000 years of experience that walks out the door every year. And I think we'd all agree that when strong advocates for any program are transferred or retired or resign or move on, if that ball is not picked up, if you haven't been thinking about the successor generation and how is this going to be taken forward, whether it's information sharing or, and you can take Muslim American community out of my remarks and put any community in there. If you're working organized crime or public corruption or counterintelligence or espionage, what's the community with whom you need the strongest connectivity so that when you need them and you really need them, you will know who to go to and there will be a trusting relationship. And so I'll end my comments with that and we'll come back to some of it in a bit.
No,
Hey, Jessica, I wanted to comment on something that Mike said.
You bet.
So just to validate what you said, Mike. So, a couple of years after 9/11, I start moving up through the ranks. I'm an assistant chief and I was tasked to go to a community meeting out in Southeast Washington, D.C. In a neighborhood not known for being extremely safe. And I'm going to the community meeting, which is in a basement in a church. And as I walk down the steps and walk in the room, I see this guy in a suit. And I look at him, I'm like, I think that's Joe Persichini, the assistant director of the FBI in charge of the Washington field office. It's like at 8:30 at night in a church in Southeast Washington. And he's there to be part of the community meeting. Just the perception from the people in the community there of the FBI and that is also a reflection of the United States government was very positive. It showed that they really cared. And I think that validates a lot of what you said, Mike, about the importance of that connection with the community. But I can also say that as a law enforcement officer, there's a joke about how local law enforcement and the FBI get along. We do all the work and they hold all the press conferences. And there's a joke to that, but the FBI agents and the cops on the ground have always got along. But sometimes, at the command level, it wasn't such a loving relationship. After 9/11, I got to say, I think the relationships between the FBI and local law enforcement at all levels improved dramatically. There was a higher level of cooperation, a higher level of trust. We got to know each other personally. Joe Persichini, like I said, was the assistant director of the FBI in charge of the Washington field office. I had his cell phone number in my phone. That never would have happened. We wouldn't even have known who the FBI leadership was before then. And so I really think that's something that you did, Mike, that it's almost like a legacy, and I think it's still there. Even in my role now in DHS and federal law enforcement, I see much stronger relationship with local law enforcement. And I think a lot of it started through after 9/11 through some of the work that you did and the FBI did back then.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you both. I know I have a lot more questions prepared, but I also have to save time for the audience to do some Q&A. So let me just ask this last question and then I'll open it up, because I want to talk about all of these changes happened right after 9/11, but it's been 2 decades now. So Caroline, if you don't mind, can you talk about the state of the available resources for law enforcement to use against current threats, like tools that existed but we no longer have, and those we did have but no longer have, those that we have but no longer need? Can you just touch upon some of those outdated tools or where the gaps are right now?
Sure, absolutely. And just to build off of some of the comments from the other panelists, I do think we're obviously talking about 9/11 because it's the 20th anniversary. It was life-changing, to say the least. It was, my generation's Pearl Harbor, and had such a profound impact on our lives, on how we do things as mundane as board a plane, on state and local and federal law enforcement relationships. But I do want to just mention, when we talk about 20 years of counterterrorism policy, we have to also keep in mind the plots, the attempted plots and the successful plots that happened after 9/11. So much of what my work was on Capitol Hill, and I know law enforcement work was also shaped by everything from Richard Reed the shoe bomber to Fort Hood to Boston Marathon, San Bernardino, Orlando nightclub, Times Square. And those are just some of the plots that made the headlines, some of the terror attacks that were unfortunately successful after 9/11. And while they weren't necessarily by any means on the same scale as 9/11, they still were tragic and deadly and had that impact on the local communities that were affected by it. But I'm going to single out Boston Marathon bombing for a second, because I think that's an example of that state, federal, local partnership being executed immediately after the bombs exploded at the finish line. And we saw what happened between federal, state, and local partners to apprehend the Tsarnaevs and to launch the investigation into the marathon bombing. So I just think, as far as the perspective of the last 2 decades, we obviously start our conversation with 9/11 often, but there is so much that has happened since then, so much that we often don't know about because it was actually prevented by some of the tools and law enforcement resources that have been put in place as a function of the Patriot Act and other laws that have been enacted since then. So I just wanted to make that kind of overarching comment before talking about your question about what tools have worked and what tools we currently have, what we might need going forward. I think unfortunately, because we have not experienced a significant terror attack on US soil, which we should all be obviously grateful for in recent years, it creates kind of an out of sight, out of mind mindset for a lot of lawmakers on Capitol Hill. And so for the purposes of those temporary provisions of the Patriot Act, the tools that were arguably some of the most useful tools to the FBI and their state and local partners were allowed to expire about 18 months ago or so. So now what we are faced with is a situation where potentially the withdrawal of Afghanistan leading to a resurgence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And really what that resurgence might look like is re-engaging individuals in the United States who are vulnerable to radicalization. That's who we saw carry out a lot of these plots in recent years. It wasn't the folks coming in on student visas to take flying lessons. It was American citizens or green card holders already living here who were radicalized. So I think first and foremost, Congress needs to return its attention to those tools that were allowed to expire. That right now, I imagine the FBI is using kind of a belt and suspenders approach to compensate for the lack of those tools. I also think that we have to have a global conversation with everybody engaged about what is the next iteration of counterterrorism enforcement going to look like. So, for example, when the Edward Snowden leaks occurred, which obviously were very controversial and resulted in the USA Freedom Act being enacted, the major program that was leaked was a telephone metadata program that collected telephone the digits dialed from landline telephone calls in order to track potential foreign terrorists that were operating in the United States. And that dates back to immediately after 9/11. Well, what do we know today? We know today that that program was voluntarily shut down by the NSA because terrorists don't talk on the phone. They sure as heck don't talk on landlines anymore. What we know is that they've switched to encrypted communication capabilities. So if we're going to have conversations about reauthorizing some of the expired provisions, but also what's missing, what are the gaps we now potentially have in those law enforcement tools, we have to have a very serious conversation about how terrorists are communicating with each other, how they are communicating with potential targets in the United States for radicalization. Obviously, in San Bernardino, we saw that the husband and wife terrorists were using an encrypted messaging platform to talk to each other. And so, I mentioned encryption, but I don't think that's the only barrier or the only issue that needs to be addressed. I think we just have to have a much more macro global conversation about what we anticipate will be coming down the pipeline. And perhaps this time put some tools in place before that next terrorist attack actually happens on US soil. Because unfortunately, I am not confident that's not going to happen. I think that it's only a matter of time now that those terrorist organizations will regroup and begin radicalizing people here in the United States again.
John or Mike, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, my thought is, and this is obviously bubbled up a lot in the last couple of weeks, given the departure from Afghanistan, and you heard maybe Director Ray's comments to Congress about how it lessens certain capabilities, which he also voiced last week at the Retired Agents Association luncheon when he was the guest speaker. And the director, Bill Burns of the CIA, has said pretty much the same thing. So the question for those who are allocating resources within counterterrorism and now domestic terrorism that we didn't really even touch on is, from where do those resources come? What do you give up when you bring them out of a certain program or downsize a program? And how do we tell just how denigrated ISIS/Al-Qaeda have been and how long it will take for them to gain capability again if we're not there? And that's the $1 million question. And there are methods and means and ways and technologies and capabilities and coverages that will get some of that. But I think it's anyone's guess as to just how much of a loss from an intelligence gathering point that will be. And I want to do one quick point on information sharing. And I know we're running out of time, and it's been a great conversation. We could spend 3 days doing this. But one of my concerns is that I'm not sure most people understand the sheer volume of information of threats that come in on a daily basis. And when the Bureau went out early on with this no threat goes unaddressed, any math major could tell you that is not physically possible. If you just look at the volume and the number of people you have to address that and the number of hours in a day, you can't get there. But the days when a GS-14 supervisor could make a rational decision based on what was in front of him or her and either open it or throw it in the trash can, those days are gone. Nobody wants to be the one holding the piece of paper that went in the trash can. And unfortunately, you wind up with a major triage operation and not so much a substantive operation getting to the root of it. And as we know, the majority of threats that come in ultimately pan out to be nothing. The majority of cases that are open ultimately don't lead to people being convicted of any crime. And more often than not, you're clearing people as opposed to putting them under a radar because they've broken a law. That will always be a challenge. The volume is not going to stop. If you look at this poor murdered girl who was missing and now the fiance who's missing, the flood of information coming in is astronomical, and somebody has to work that. And those people were probably working some other case in some other program last week, but today and this week, this is what they're working. So it's constantly, as any manager would admit, a juggling of resources, aligning them with your priorities, and hoping that you can get it somewhere near right. I'll stop there.
Ron, did you have something you wanted to say in response?
Yeah, I think, we don't know where the next terrorist attack will bubble up from. And I think we're in peril. I think the threat is bigger now than maybe ever because the threat is broader and we have to stay vigilant. And yet at the same time, as Mike said earlier, with retirements and reassignments, we've lost a lot of the people that helped craft a lot of these policies in the beginning. And so we have to stay vigilant. I was working on with the ICP Homeland Security Committee that developed a resolution calling for a new information sharing summit. And I was pleased with when the ICP leadership and DHS leadership announced that they would host that summit. Details are still forthcoming, but we hadn't had a summit to address that since 2008. And so, as people retire and as people move away and as memories fade, I don't want us to go back to where we were on 9/10. When I look at the Torrance case of a group of robbers, armed robbers, that the Torrance Police Department was working, thinking they were just everyday criminals, and then found out that they were using those robbery proceeds to buy weapons to attack military installations and Jewish synagogues and Jewish community centers. We don't know where the next, when you're looking at crime, we don't know where the next, link to terrorism might be. So I think we've got to stay vigilant. I'm very pleased about this information sharing summit, but we've got a lot of work still to do.
Well, thank you. But you're not done yet, because I am now going to go through the audience members' questions. The first one, if there was a flow chart of where the information gathered at the community level, city level, goes to the fusion center, where does it go next? I heard governor, but then where? And then who are the final actors who address the problems?
So the governors designate fusion centers, but they don't necessarily receive the information from the fusion centers. So fusion centers will triage that information just as if it came into an FBI field office, they would do the same. Or if it came into a local police department, they would do the same and decide who it needs to go to. Is this information that's on drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, true terrorism, human trafficking? Who is the best agency or group of agencies to deal with that? And that's the beauty of using our national network of fusion centers as an information sharing portal with trained analysts to make sense of that information and decide where it needs to be sent for follow-up investigation.
Sure. So it's dependent on circumstances. There's not a set path, is what you're saying.
It is, but the beauty of this though is now with the national network of fusion centers, we have a collection portal, we have a process, and we have dramatically increased analytic capacity. In the old days, very few law enforcement agencies had trained analysts. Even our federal partners were understaffed with trained analysts. Now with analytic training capabilities, not only fusion centers, but many of our local agencies have internal, well-trained, not crime analysts, not people that decide, CompStat analysts, but true intelligence analysts that are looking at, using critical thinking to look at threats and to advise decision makers.
Jessica, I wanted to just piggyback off something, and I think it was really important to have Caroline on the call, because it is a different day and age. I mean, Ron was talking about we're now 20 years forward and the profession has changed. There's more of a suspicion of the profession today. And just talking, Mike talked about the volume of information coming in, and Ron Brooks talking about how we analyze that information. But back in 2001, we didn't have body cameras. We didn't have cell phones in everybody's hand. We didn't have facial recognition. We didn't have artificial intelligence. So we now have all of those tools available. But at the same time, now there is some suspicion of and distrust of law enforcement. And I think it's really going to be challenging for law enforcement. We have the example of Chief Haddad talking about respect for communities and Caroline talking about privacy. But law enforcement is honestly just trying to do their job, and they're going to need to be able to sort through information. And we need to gain the public's trust and have the public's trust that those of us in law enforcement will be doing the right thing, using the information properly, and in the end, saving lives and thwarting attacks. And so I just wanted to mention that the context of today does make it very challenging for law enforcement to continue to protect against international and domestic terrorism.
Well, Josh, since you are speaking, let me just read to you some comments that address you specifically. Two people wanted to say thank you for sharing your personal perspective with details that help them understand. And someone else wrote that they feel very connected to you. So thank you for sharing your story and your honest reflection. Also, they thank the rest of the participants today as well. But I just wanted to read those while Josh was speaking. Another audience member wanted to assure all listeners who were responders to any of the attack scenes to register with the World Trade Center Health Program and the 911 Victim Compensation Fund. Here is question. Does the suspicious activity report as the submitter of the form of the, I'm so sorry, of the level of threat of the submitter's idea, impression of possible resolutions to, I'm sorry, I don't understand that question. We're going to move on. Is communications interoperability better today than it was 9/11? Obviously, technology has advanced, but that doesn't mean it's fixed all the issues. Who wants to take that one?
I can take that. I can tell you that without question, it's better. We have police and fire and medical response all talking together. I can tell you here in Dearborn, we have a regional dispatch center that dispatches for 7 communities around us. And we have the capabilities of getting on our radio systems with everybody in the state. So out of 9/11, definitely the communication aspect was front and center, and it was part of the failure, if you will, or lessons learned, let's put it that way. And I think that there's plenty of work to be done. Politically, people don't want to give up their own little centers because they think something is being taken away from them. So we have to convince people that there's more benefit to work together with the communications. But certainly technology today is much advanced as opposed to 20 years ago.
I wanted to build on that. I think Chief Haddad is right in some communities, but not in every. So the technology is much better, but it always boils down to people and policy. Who's willing to share? Nobody wants to cede sovereignty over their media, their data, so I find that we still have instances, including in talking to colleagues that responded on January 6th, that certain agencies are not able to communicate. And I know Josh might be the best of all of us to answer this with his work on the FirstNet Authority when he served there.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that, back on 9/11, being in the field, everything was very focused on handheld radio communication. But today, just think of all the technology items that I just mentioned. So we really need to have access to a working network. If you've been to a concert or a stadium, I guess pre-COVID, and you tried to, post a picture of yourself, good luck with all those people trying to make calls. Imagine during a terrorist attack or a major event, And this is where the 9/11 Commission recommended the creation of FirstNet, which is, for those who don't know, it's the First Responder Network Authority. I like to describe it as sort of like the Verizon or an AT&T, but for law enforcement. And it's its own public safety network. And, that was a recommendation to give Spectrum, which is, again, I'm not technical, what your phones and computers wirelessly work on, to law enforcement. And that took years. But first on and using this technology, I think that was one of the largest, I think the president had called it one of the largest technological projects in our country's history for public safety. And I think that the creation of FirstNet, I think it's been hugely successful and will be an essential tool for public safety and law enforcement going forward. And, that exists and in operation today.
Okay, I'm going to read the last question, and then we might have a few more minutes for final thoughts. But on January 7th, I saw a large white truck with curtains in the window parked under a metro bridge on the Maryland, DC border. Cars don't usually park there. I reported it because I thought it a vulnerable location. It would be rewarding if, when you see something, say something, that someone got back to you at some point and let you know someone checked it out and appreciate it. It's the grassroots of information sharing, but I guess it's manpower. I think this makes a good point, because if you're trying to build these relationships of trust and encourage people to share information with you, so how do you do the dueling challenges here? Encouraging people to share, but also getting back to them when you're triaging all of these see something, say something alerts.
I would say that's one of many challenges that's just not going to go away. You're entirely right that it would be wonderful to have the luxury of time to pick up a phone and call that person and express the appreciation that they were trying to do something proactive and positive and be helpful. And they should get that recognition. And it's probably more just a matter of time than anything else.
I do think that technology
Thank you,
plays a role. I do think that technology plays a role. Right before the pandemic, I was on the Washington, D.C. Metro, which is the subway system, and there was an unattended backpack. And yes, see something, say something is in my head. And right above, inside the train, was a number where you could text the Metro Transit Police. I texted the Metro Transit Police. I got a response back immediately. What train card number are you on? And they told me the train card number and what line. And then I got off the train, and a couple of minutes later, I got a text back from the transit police saying, "Thank you very much for your information. We found the backpack," and whatever, there was nothing to it. But I was actually surprised to get the response back from the transit police. So I understand what the questioner is saying. But I do think that there's infrastructure now to intake information, and we see it time after time where it's been working. I think one of the greatest changes, or one of the benefit changes, has been better training for our 911 centers, where dispatchers ask better questions, they have access to more technology, and then they convey that to the first responders in the field, more information, more accurate information. There's still room for improvement there, but it's been leap and bounds improvements from 9/11.
Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in before I ask my last question, since I see there's enough time? Okay, Chief Ron, this one's for you. I know that some of the innovative programs you implemented are very much still applicable today, such as the anti-bullying campaign. So can you tell us how that translates to today's threats, and are there other programs that do so as well?
There's the anti-bullying campaign that we started here in Dearborn with the public school system has been recognized by our state, and the governor passed a law that every school district has to have a similar policy that makes bullying unacceptable and requires everyone at every level to report it, from the children watching it to a parent, teacher, etc. And I think that it's changed the no snitch climate, if you will, because people have bought into it in large number here, and they report crime in general more often here. And so it's proven to be very successful. We had a couple of other things that really drew the community together. We had K2 epidemic. I don't know if you know what that is. There was a smoking of this potpourri that would get people high, mentally high. And we had a very, great teacher here that was killed by his son after smoking it. And within 2 weeks, we had the governor sign law outlawing K2 for sale at all the gas stations and party stores in our city. And it got pushed throughout the whole state. So when doing these type of things for our community, with our community, it's really generated a lot of trust that we can make things happen and make things better for our community. So going forward, we continue to engage every aspect of our community. Sometimes it's a high-end meeting with, all the directors, leaders, principals, CEOs, et cetera. And other times it's people right at the grassroots in their little neighborhoods. And we try to, systematically go through the entire city once a year and give everyone an opportunity to let us know how we can better serve them. And the point about getting back with people is so important, because the minute you don't, on something of the simplest means, they call and say, you forgot or you didn't do anything about it. So it's very important. If you want them to continue to be engaged, you have to get back with them and make them part of the process. Another thing we developed here in Dearborn was the mental health intervention model. And it takes actions that teeter on violence before they cross that line of criminality, and we try to get them help. And we have convinced our community, and they've responded, that if you have somebody that is suffering some type of mental fitness issue and they're teetering on violence within the home, at their schools, on their jobs, domestic violence, etc., report them before they commit a crime. And we send out social workers. We have our social agencies that actually have 2 people assigned up in our DB. And again, I can't tell you what would have happened, but at least a half a dozen times they've reported people within their family members that were really heading towards something violent. And we took the weapons out of the homes, advised them on credit cards with young people, and they've worked out for the better so far. And again, that was looked at by everyone from Harvard to USC. We didn't do it in a vacuum. We wanted everybody's opinion on this program. And basically they said, what took you so long to figure this simple thing out? But again, and when you look at all these mass shooters, for example, there's always a component that somebody knew they were up to something and didn't report it. And when you look at most of them, they weren't, readily known to law enforcement. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but most of our mass shooters are of that caliber, and they had mental fitness issues. So if we can get to that individual before they do something violent, we may have a few less tragedies in our nation.
Yeah, that's great. And it sounds so simple, but again, it takes time and resources and partnerships. So kudos to you for putting that together. Ron, I saw you unmute. Did you have a thought you wanted to share?
I just wanted, as we're getting ready to wrap up, I was kind of thinking back about, what were the most significant changes after 9/11? And I really think that the most significant change, and everybody on this panel has pretty much talked about it, is that in the 28 years that I was a cop before 9/11, most times when we had federal guidance, it came from the top down. The Department of Justice or the Bureau or some other agency would say, hey, here's the way we're going to do it. And after 9/11, when we created the CICC and the DNI Partners Board and some of the other groups that dealt with all of this, it was a real collaboration where we sat together on equal footing representatives from all the state and local law enforcement associations and our federal partners, the FBI, the DHS components once they were established, DEA, ATF, all of them. And so that real even, even collaborative decision process and policy making, I think that's the biggest change. And it has carried us not just in the fight against terrorism, but that has helped us as we address everyday crime issues. And it is probably the biggest and most significant change that I've seen in the now almost 47 years that I've been at this.
I see Marcia. So before I kick it over to Marcia, I just wanted to personally thank you all for taking the time for this conversation today. You're such a wealth of knowledge and experience, and I know we could talk for several more hours, if not days, on the things that you've seen and learned and the best practices, but we only had an hour and a half, so I hope that you feel like you got to share enough today, and perhaps we'll get to speak again. I know you're very busy, so thank you for taking the time today.
Thanks, Jessica. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. And what an incredible panel, and what incredible supporters of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. To everyone on the screen, we truly appreciate your participation. I would like to also mention again, because it's worth noting that we can't have these programs without support. So again, another big shout out to the Police Unity Tour, Goodyear, Bio1 Inc., Thomson Reuters, 511 Tactical, Adam Rose, Peter McQuillan, and individuals across the country who understand our mission to tell the story of American law enforcement. If you would like to support us with a donation, please go to lawenforcementmuseum.org, where you'll be able to make a donation right online, or consider making a gift today by texting programs 2021 to 41444. As a reminder, the National Law Enforcement Museum is now reopened to the public, so please visit our website for more information. And Police Weekend 2021 is on, and it is scheduled for October 14th through the 17th here in Washington, D.C. And the Candlelight Vigil is on for Thursday, October 14th at 6 p.m. on the National Mall. And lastly, please join us for our next program in our post 9/11 exhibit series, which will stream on October 11th at 8 p.m. It's titled Memorials and the Meaning of Memory. That program will give us a chance to reflect on the roles of memorials in our lives, especially in light of the great losses experienced on 9/11. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the museum. Have a good one.